The ballroom was full of light and music, and yet the room felt like a held breath. The candles in the great chandelier dripped slow tears of wax onto the polished floor below, where ladies in pale silk turned in the arms of men who smelled of pipe smoke and pomade. The fire in the hearth crackled and spat, sending up the warm scent of burning oak. Servants moved along the walls with silver trays, their shoes whispering over the marble. And in the center of it all stood a young woman in a gown the color of river stone, her gloved hands folded neatly at her waist, her chin lifted, her eyes very still. Her name was Maren Ashcombe, and she was 22 years old, and she had come tonight believing she was to be made a wife. The Duke of Pellingham stood 3 steps in front of her. He was tall and broad in the shoulders, with hair the color of wet sand, and a jaw that had been carved sharp by good blood and better tailors. He held a glass of dark wine in one hand. He did not look at her face when he spoke. He looked just past her ear, the way a man looks at a painting he has decided not to buy. "I cannot do it," he said. His voice was not loud, but the room had grown quiet around them, the way rooms do when something terrible is about to be said. "I had hoped, when I agreed to meet you, that I might find something I could grow used to, but you are too plain, Miss Ashcombe, too plain to be my wife. I am sorry. I will not pretend otherwise to spare you." The fire popped. A glass clinked somewhere far away. A woman near the door let out a small, sharp sound that was almost a laugh, and almost not. Maren did not move. She did not lower her eyes. She felt the cold air pressing against the back of her neck, where the small curls had come loose from their pins. She felt the silk of her gloves growing damp at the wrist. She felt the heat climbing up her throat, and she swallowed it down, swallowed it down, swallowed it down until it sat heavy in her chest like a stone she would carry from this room. She had known, in some quiet corner of herself, that the Duke had agreed to the meeting only as a favor to his late mother's old friend, who was her own godmother. She had known her own face was not the kind that turned heads at the opera. She had a long nose and a wide mouth, and brows that her aunt had once said looked too serious for a girl. Her hair was brown, simply brown, neither dark nor light. Her eyes were grey. She was not ugly. She was simply not what a duke was supposed to want. But she had hoped. God help her, she had hoped. She had spent the carriage ride from her godmother's house, turning her gloves over in her lap, smoothing the seam at the wrist with her thumb, again and again. She had practiced saying his name in her head. She had imagined what it would feel like to be chosen, to be wanted, to stop being the quiet niece in the back of every drawing room. And now he had spoken, and the room had heard him, and the music had not started again. Maren took a small breath through her nose. The air smelled of beeswax and rosewater, and the faint, sour edge of spilled champagne. She lowered her body into a curtsy. It was a deep one, precise, the kind taught in the schoolroom by an old governess with a long ruler. Her knees did not tremble. Her back stayed straight. She rose again with the same slow grace. She did not speak. She did not weep. She turned and she walked. She walked past the Duke. She walked past the daughters of 2 earls who were watching her with their fans half lifted to their mouths. She walked past her godmother, whose hand reached out and then fell back to her side, defeated, ashamed. She walked past the long mirror by the door, and she did not look. She walked past the footman, who opened the door without meeting her eye, perhaps because he had heard, perhaps because he was kind. Then she was in the great hall, where the marble floor was cold even through her slippers, and the candles in the wall sconces flickered as she passed. The sound of her own steps came back to her from the high stone ceiling. She heard nothing else. She walked. She found the cloakroom. She took her own cloak from the rack. The wool was heavy and rough under her fingers. She fastened the clasp at her throat herself. Her hands did not shake. She would not let them shake here where someone might see. Outside, the night was sharp with cold. The air smelled of wet leaves and horse sweat, and the smoke of 100 chimneys. The fog moved low along the street, curling around the legs of the waiting horses. Her godmother's carriage was not yet ready. She did not wait for it. She started down the long stone steps, holding her cloak closed at the throat. At the bottom she stopped. She pressed her gloved hand flat against the cold iron of the railing. She let her forehead rest, only for a moment, against the back of her own hand. The metal was so cold it bit through the silk. Her breath came out in a small white cloud. She closed her eyes. She did not weep. She breathed. In, out. In, out. She counted each breath the way her old governess had once taught her to count ceiling tiles, because counting was a thing the body could do when the mind would not be still. A man's voice spoke from the top of the steps. Not loud, quiet, the way a man speaks when he is uncertain whether he should be speaking at all. "Miss Ashcombe." She did not turn. She did not lift her head. She thought for a foolish second that it might be the Duke, that he had come to take it back, that he had remembered some shred of kindness left in him. But the voice was wrong, lower, rougher, a voice she did not know. She straightened. She turned. She kept her hand on the railing because the railing was the only thing in the world right now that was solid and cold and would not lie to her. A man stood at the top of the steps, 3 down from the open doorway. He was tall, but not in the way the Duke was tall. He stood like a man who had carried things. His hair was very dark, cut short. He wore a long black coat, well made but plain, with no medal pinned to it, no ribbon. He was not handsome in the way the Duke was handsome. His face was bony and serious, with a long mouth and a small scar that ran from his temple into the hairline. He was perhaps 30 years old. She had never seen him before in her life. "Miss Ashcombe," he said again. He did not come closer. "I do not wish to intrude, but the night is bitter, and your carriage is not yet brought round. May I ask a servant to fetch it?" She looked at him for a long moment. The fog moved between them. Somewhere a horse stamped its hoof against the cobblestones. From the open door above, a thin strand of music had begun again, hesitant, as if the orchestra were not certain whether they were still allowed to play. "That is kind of you, sir," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was almost surprised by it. "But I prefer to walk. It is nearly a mile to your godmother's house. I know how far it is." He did not argue. He did not move. He looked at her with steady, dark eyes, and she felt, with a small jolt under her ribs, that he had been in the ballroom, that he had heard, that he was not asking her about a carriage because he cared about a carriage. He was asking because he did not want her to walk alone into the fog with whatever was inside her now. "Then permit me to walk beside you," he said. "I will not speak. I will not press my company on you. But I should not like to read in tomorrow's paper that a lady of good name was found in a ditch because no one had the manners to see her home." She almost laughed. The almost laugh hurt more than tears would have. She nodded once. "As you wish, sir." He came down the steps. He did not offer her his arm. He had the wisdom not to. He simply walked beside her, one full step behind and to the left, the way a footman might, except that he kept her pace, and she had the sense that he was matching his stride to hers without thinking about it. They walked through the gate. The street stretched ahead of them, lit by the wavering yellow of lamps on tall iron poles. Each lamp made a small ring of light, and between the rings was a longer stretch of dark. The cobblestones were slick with damp. Her slippers were not made for this, and she could feel each stone through the thin sole. The cold was already in her toes. The cold was in her ears. The cold was in the bones of her wrists, where the gloves did not reach. She did not say his name because she did not know it. She did not ask. She kept walking. He kept his word. He did not speak. For 10 minutes there was only the sound of their 2 pairs of shoes on wet stone, and far off the rattle of a cart, and once the soft hooting of an owl from somewhere in the park across the road. When they reached the corner of Carver Street, she stopped. She had not planned to stop. Her body simply would not go forward. She stood under the lamp at the corner, and she pressed her hand to her chest, and she breathed in, and the breath came out of her in a sound she did not mean to make. It was not a sob. It was smaller than that. It was the sound a kettle makes just before it sings, only quieter, and it tore something inside her on the way out. He stopped 2 steps past her. He did not turn around at once. He gave her a moment. Then he turned, slowly, and he said, very low, "Take your time, Miss Ashcombe. The hour is no friend of ours tonight, but it is also in no great hurry." She nodded without looking at him. She put her hand flat against the cold iron of the lamppost. She thought about how the iron was cold, and the cold was real, and the lamppost would still be a lamppost tomorrow, and so would she. "Thank you, sir," she said. "I am sorry. I do not know your name." "Gideon Renmark," he said. "I am a cousin of Lord Pellingham, a distant cousin. We have met perhaps 3 times in our lives, and never with much warmth. I was at the ball only because my aunt insisted." He paused. "I did not know what he intended to say to you. If I had known, I should have liked to spare you it." She looked up at him then. His face under the lamp was lit on one side and dark on the other. He did not look at her with pity. That was the thing. He looked at her the way a man looks at another person who has been hurt and who is bearing it, and he was waiting to see what she needed. "There was nothing to spare," she said. "He said what he meant. That is more than most men do." The corner of his mouth moved, but it was not a smile. "That is a very generous thing to say of him," he said. "I am not feeling generous, Mr. Renmark. I am only tired." She started walking again. He fell in beside her. They reached her godmother's house 10 minutes later. He stopped at the gate. He bowed, once, a clean, small bow, with his hand at his side and not flourished. He did not ask if he could call upon her. He did not press a card into her hand. He waited until she had reached the door, until the butler had opened it for her, until she had stepped inside. Only then did he turn and walk back into the fog. She did not cry that night either. She lay in her narrow bed in her godmother's 3rd bedroom, and she stared at the ceiling, and she counted the cracks in the plaster. There were 11. She had counted them before. She counted them again. Then she rolled onto her side and watched the embers in the small grate, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, she finally slept. In the morning, the papers carried it. Not all of them, 2. One was a small column at the bottom of a society page, which mentioned only that a certain duke was overheard at the Ledborough ball, expressing his dissatisfaction with a lady's appearance in the bluntest possible terms. The other, more vicious, named her. It used the word plain. It used it twice. Her godmother read it at the breakfast table, with her hand over her mouth. The smell of toast and bitter tea filled the small parlour. The fire was low because coal was dear. Her godmother was a widow of modest means, and she had taken Marin in after her parents had died of the fever when Marin was 16. And she loved Marin in a careful, anxious way that always seemed to expect the worst. "My dear girl," her godmother said. Marin reached for the toast. The toast was cold. She buttered it anyway. "It is only a newspaper, godmother. You do not understand. This will follow you. Every drawing room in town will be speaking of it by Friday. You will not get another offer. Not now. Not after this." "Then I shall not get another offer," Marin said. She bit into the toast. The butter had not melted. She chewed it slowly. Her godmother began to cry, soft, ladylike crying, into a small linen handkerchief that smelled of lavender. Marin reached across the table and patted her hand. "It is well, godmother. I had not really expected one in the first place." That was the worst thing she could have said. Her godmother cried harder. Marin sat with her until she had stopped. Then she went up to her room, and she took down her writing case, and she wrote 3 letters. One was to her elder brother, who had a small living as a country parson 2 days' ride to the north, and whose wife had been begging for help with the children for a year. One was to a Mrs. Halliver, who ran a small school for the daughters of clergymen and minor gentry in a village called Thornbury in Yorkshire, and who had once offered Marin a position teaching the younger girls their letters and their sums. One was to her godmother, to be left on the writing desk, thanking her and telling her not to grieve. By the end of the week she was gone. She went first to her brother's parsonage. She stayed 3 weeks. She helped his wife with the 4 children, who were sticky and loud and dear. She mended their stockings by the kitchen fire. She read aloud to them from a book of psalms in the evenings. Her brother was a good man but a tired one, and he spoke very little, and when he did speak he was inclined to lecture her gently about the dangers of pride. She listened. She did not argue. She knew that he meant well. After the 3 weeks she went on to Thornbury. Mrs. Halliver met her at the coaching inn herself, in a worn black gown and a bonnet that had seen many summers. The school was a low stone building beside a small church. The yard smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. The girls, 12 of them, ranged in age from 6 to 14. They looked at Maren with the open, careful curiosity of children who had been told a stranger was coming. "This is Miss Ashcombe," Mrs. Halliver said. "She will be teaching you reading and writing and the use of globes and a little French. You will mind her as you mind me." The youngest girl, a child of 6 with a runny nose and one missing front tooth, came forward and held out a fistful of wilted yellow flowers. "For you, miss," she said. Maren knelt down. The stone of the yard was cold through her skirt. She took the flowers carefully, as if they had been a wedding bouquet. "They are very pretty," she said. "What are they called?" "Don't know, miss. They grow in the ditch." "Then we shall find out together," Maren said. "Tomorrow, in the lesson." The child smiled. The smile had a hole in it where the tooth had been. Maren felt something move under her ribs, small but real. She stood up. That was the beginning. For 3 years, Maren lived in Thornbury. She lived in a small room above the schoolhouse. The room had a narrow bed, a washstand, a writing desk, a fireplace that smoked when the wind came from the north, and one window that looked out over the churchyard and beyond it to the dark line of the moor. Her wages were small. Her clothes wore thin at the elbows. In winter, the water in her wash basin froze by morning. She did not mind. She taught the girls their letters. She taught them their sums. She taught them to read aloud from the Book of Common Prayer and from a battered volume of Mr. Cooper's poems. She taught the older ones a little French, badly, from a grammar that had once belonged to her mother. She taught the youngest to spell her own name. She walked them in a careful line to church each Sunday, 2 by 2, holding hands. She also taught herself things. In the evenings, after the girls had gone home to their families or up to the dormitory, she sat at her writing desk by the smoky fire, and she read. She read history. She read the few volumes of natural philosophy that the vicar lent her. She read newspapers when she could get them, sometimes weeks old by the time they reached her hands. She read everything she could find about the wider world, because the wider world had once shut a door in her face, and she had decided she would not be ignorant of it again. She did not think about the Duke of Pellingham. That is, she did not let herself think about the Duke of Pellingham. Now and then his name appeared in a newspaper, a horse he had bought, a speech he had given, a subscription ball he had attended. She read these and turned the page. She had decided very early that she would not give him the gift of her grief. She would not let him live, even as a ghost, in the small, clean rooms of her mind. She thought sometimes about Gideon Renmark. She thought about him at odd hours, when she was walking the girls home through the village in the early evening, and the lamps were being lit in the cottages, and the smell of stewed onions and wood smoke drifted from the open doors. She would remember the way he had walked one full step behind her in the fog, matching her pace without seeming to. When she could not sleep and lay staring at the cracked plaster of her low ceiling, she would remember his voice saying her name, Miss Ashcombe, as if her name were a thing of weight and worth, and not a syllable to be muttered like an apology. She wrote him a letter once, 6 months after she left London. It was a short letter. It said, "I thank you, sir, for your kindness on a cold night, and I hope this finds you in good health." She did not give an address for reply. She sent it through her godmother. She did not know if her godmother had ever forwarded it. She did not ask. In the 3rd year, in the autumn, 2 things happened in Thornbury that changed everything. The first was that Mrs. Halliver fell ill, a slow illness of the chest. The doctor came up from York and shook his head and said it was a matter of months. Mrs. Halliver bore it with the patience of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and 1 child, and expected nothing easier from God. She made arrangements. She set her affairs in order. She sat Maren down one evening in the small parlour by the fire, with a cup of weak tea steaming between them and the cat curled at her feet, and she told her that she wished her to take over the school. "You will not be paid well, child. You will not be paid much more than you are now. But the building is yours to use, and the girls are yours to teach, and I should die easier knowing you were here." Maren took the old woman's hand. The hand was thin and cold, and the skin moved loose over the bones. "I shall stay, Mum," she said. "I shall do my best." Mrs. Halliver squeezed her fingers weakly and closed her eyes. The second thing was that a man arrived in the village. He came on a black horse in the late afternoon. The horse was muddy to the knees. The man was muddy to the knees as well. He wore a long, dark coat, plain, well-made. He had a bony, serious face, a long mouth, and a small scar that ran from his temple into the hairline. His hair was very dark and cut short. He looked older than Maren remembered him. There was a deeper line between his brows, but it was the same face. He stopped at the village inn. He asked the innkeeper for the schoolhouse. The innkeeper, who was a great gossip, told everyone in the village within the hour that a London gentleman had come asking for Miss Ashcombe. By the time Gideon Renmark walked through the small gate of the schoolyard, every curtain on the lane was twitching. Maren was in the yard with two of the older girls. They were turning a rope for a third girl to skip. The afternoon was bright and cold. The smell of wood smoke came from the cottages. Somewhere a hen was complaining. The skipping girl was laughing breathlessly, her ribbon coming loose from her hair. Maren looked up. She saw him at the gate. She did not move for a long moment. The rope kept turning. The girl kept skipping. The hen kept complaining. In Maren's chest, something old and quiet and stubborn stood up very slowly, like an animal that had been sleeping for 3 years and was now awake. "Anwen," she said to the older of the two rope-turners, "take the rope. Take the girls inside. Tell Mrs. Halliver I shall be in directly." Anwen looked at her, then at the man at the gate. Anwen was 14 and missed nothing. She nodded once and gathered the girls and herded them toward the door. Maren wiped her hands on her apron. She walked to the gate. She did not hurry. She did not slow. He took off his hat. He held it against his chest. "Miss Ashcombe." "Mr. Renmark." The little wind moved between them. It smelled of cold leaves and far-off rain. "You remember me," he said. "I am not in the habit of forgetting strangers who have been kind." He looked down at his hat. He turned the brim between his fingers. He looked up again. "May I speak with you? Not here. Anywhere you choose. Anywhere proper. I have come a long way, and I should not like to come all the way back to Yorkshire a second time." She thought about this. She thought about it carefully. She thought about Mrs. Halliver inside, dying slowly in her chair, and about the girls, and about her small, good life in this small, good place, and about the fact that whatever this man had come to say would change something, because men did not ride 3 days from London to a village in Yorkshire to say nothing. "There is a stile at the end of the lane," she said. "Beyond it a path along the hedge. We may walk there. The girls will see us through the window, but they will not hear us." "That will do," he said. They walked. The path was narrow, with hawthorn hedges on either side, the last red berries clinging to the dark twigs. A blackbird scolded them from somewhere deeper in the hedge. The ground was soft and gave under their boots. The sky was the colour of old pewter. For a long stretch he did not speak. She let him not speak. She had learned, in 3 years of teaching, that people will say what they mean if you do not press them for it. At last he said, "I had your letter." "My letter?" "From your godmother. She sent it on. It took some months. I have carried it in my pocket ever since." He paused. "I read it once a week, in the first year. After that, less often. But I have not lost it." Maren did not look at him. She watched the path. "It was a small letter, Mr. Renmark. It was thanks, no more. It was the first kind letter I had ever received from a person who did not want something from me," he said. "I am the heir to a small estate in Northumberland, and a smaller fortune than people suppose. I have been hunted for 10 years by every mother in 3 counties. Your letter asked for nothing. I read it and I thought, this is a person who is alive in the world, who is not asking me for anything. I should like to know what becomes of her." She walked on. The blackbird flew up out of the hedge and away across the field, a black dart against the grey sky. "What becomes of me is that I teach 12 girls their letters and their sums. What becomes of me is that Mrs. Halliver is dying, and I shall run her school after she is gone. What becomes of me, sir, is small and quiet and mine. I did not write asking to be rescued. I did not come to rescue you." "Then why did you come?" He stopped walking. She stopped too, 2 paces ahead, and turned. He was a tall man, but he had a way of standing that did not loom. He stood with his hands at his sides, holding his hat. The wind moved his dark hair on his forehead. The small scar on his temple was very pale in the cold afternoon light. "My cousin is to be married," he said. "The Duke of Pellingham. The announcement was made last week." "I wish him very well." "He is to marry Miss Petra Calder. She is 16 years old. Her father holds a note of debt against my cousin for £40,000. The match was arranged in March. She has not been consulted." Marin said nothing. "I tell you this," Gideon said, "not because I think you wish to hear it, but because I am about to ask you something, and I should like you to understand the world the question comes out of." "Then ask, Mr. Renmark." He looked at her. He looked at her for what felt like a long time. The wind moved in the hedge. Somewhere far off, a sheep bleated, a small, lonely sound. "I came to ask if you would consider receiving me as a suitor." Marin did not answer at once. She felt the cold of the path through the soles of her boots. She felt the bite of the wind on her cheek. She felt, somewhere very deep inside her chest, a small old wound open and bleed once, and then close again. "You do not know me, sir," she said. "We have met twice. You have a letter of thanks from me. That is all." "I know that," he said. "I am not here to declare a great love. I should be a liar if I did. I am here to ask if I may, in time, come to know you. I am here because in 3 years I have not been able to stop wondering what became of the woman who curtsied and walked out of that ballroom without a word. I have been to a great many balls since then. I have met a great many young ladies. None of them, Miss Ashcombe, has curtsied like that." The corner of her mouth almost moved. She did not let it. "That is a poor reason to ride 3 days into Yorkshire." "It is the reason I have." She turned and walked again. He fell in beside her. They walked perhaps 50 paces in silence. "My answer is not yes," she said at last. "It is also not no. My answer is that I have a school to run, and an old woman to bury, and 12 girls who need me. My answer is that you may write to me. If your letters are honest and not pressing, I shall write back. If, in a year, you still wish to come to Thornbury, you may come. If, in that year, you find someone more suited to your station and your name, I shall not hold it against you. I shall expect it." He nodded. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has been given more than he hoped for and is afraid to show it. "That is fair," he said. "That is very fair." They walked back. At the stile, he bowed. He did not try to take her hand. He swung up onto his muddy horse and turned its head south. She watched him go to the bend of the lane. She watched until the dark shape of horse and rider was gone behind the hedge. Then she went back into the schoolhouse, where the girls were waiting, wide-eyed, and Mrs. Halliver was waiting too, weakly smiling from her chair, and Marin clapped her hands and said, "Slates out, girls. We have lost half an hour. We shall not lose another." Mrs. Halliver died 3 weeks later, in her sleep, with the cat at her feet. Marin buried her in the small churchyard and wept for the first time in 3 years, not for herself, but for the old woman who had taken her in. The girls cried too. They all wore black ribbons for a month. The letters began the next week. Gideon Renmark wrote on plain paper, in a small, careful hand. His first letter described his journey home, the inn at Doncaster, where the beds were full of fleas, the cold morning he had ridden through the peaks, the fact that he had been thrown from his horse once and had to walk it 3 miles to find a smith. He did not flatter her. He did not write of love. He wrote like a man making conversation across a table. She wrote back. She told him about Mrs. Halliver's funeral. She told him about the cat, who had taken to sleeping on her own bed now, and who snored. She told him about the youngest girl, who could now read 3 whole sentences without help. His next letter came 2 weeks later. He told her about his own estate, which was small and old and damp, and which he had inherited at 22 when his father died. He told her about his mother, who was alive and difficult, and lived in London because the country bored her. He told her about a book he was reading on the draining of marshland, and what he hoped to learn from it. She wrote back about the moor in winter. So it went, for 1 year, exactly as she had said. There were 31 letters in all. She kept them in a wooden box under her bed. She did not read them often. She did not have to. She had read each one carefully when it came, and she knew them. In the 7th month, something happened that she did not learn of from him. A traveller came through the village, a man on his way to Edinburgh, who stopped at the inn for a night and was given dinner. He fell into talk with the vicar, who had come down for his pint, and the talk turned, as talk in villages does, to news of the south. The traveller told the vicar that he had passed 2 days before through a village called Brimble, on the edge of Northumberland. There had been a fire there in the autumn, a bad fire that had taken 6 cottages and killed an old man and his grandson. The local landlord, said the traveller, had rebuilt the cottages out of his own pocket, not as charity, but quietly, with no fuss. The landlord had also paid the funeral costs and given a small sum to the widow of the old man. The traveller said it was the kind of thing that did not happen often these days. The vicar asked the landlord's name. The traveller said it was a Mr. Gideon Renmark, of Renmark Hall. The vicar told Marin the next morning, in passing, over tea in the vicarage parlour, while the rain came down outside and the kettle hissed on the hob. Marin held her cup very still in both hands. The cup was warm. The steam smelled of weak black tea and a little milk. "That was kind of him," she said. "Quite remarkable," said the vicar. "It is so rare that men of property do such things quietly. Most would have insisted on a plaque." Marin went home that afternoon and sat at her writing desk and did not write a letter. She did not tell Gideon what she had heard. She did not want him to know that she had heard. She thought of the old man and the grandson, and of the new roofs on the cottages, and of the small thin widow whose name she did not know, and she pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes for a long moment. He did not mention it in his next letter. He never mentioned it. In the 11th month, a different visitor came. He came in a fine carriage, with a coat of arms on the door, and 4 matched bay horses, and 2 liveried footmen at the back. The carriage could barely fit through the lane. Half the village came out to stare. The Duke of Pellingham stepped down. He was older than Marin remembered him. He had thickened around the middle. There were small purple veins along his nose. His coat was very fine, but it strained at the buttons. He looked around the muddy lane with the expression of a man who had not expected so much mud. He came to the schoolhouse door. He knocked with the silver head of his walking stick. Marin opened the door herself, because the girls were at their slates and there was no servant. She had a smear of chalk on her cheek. She had not noticed it. She looked at him and did not show surprise. The Duke had once told her she was too plain to be his wife, in front of a room full of people. There was nothing he could say to her now that would surprise her. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. "Your Grace." He waited for her to invite him in. She did not invite him in. The girls were behind her, working. She did not wish them to see this man. "May we speak?" he said. "We may speak in the churchyard," she said. "It is a short walk." He frowned, but he nodded. He waited while she fetched her shawl. She told Anwen to mind the room. She walked the Duke down the lane and through the lich gate and into the small, old churchyard, where Mrs. Halliver's grave was still bare of grass, and a few late asters had been laid on it by the youngest girl that morning. She stopped by the church wall. The stone was rough and cold under her hand. The air smelled of wet earth and the smoke of the vicar's chimney. "You wished to speak, sir?" He cleared his throat. He had not expected a churchyard. He had not expected, perhaps, to be told to walk anywhere. "I have heard," he said, "that my cousin Renmark has been corresponding with you." "Have you?" "He is a fool. He has come to me twice this autumn asking my opinion. I have given it. He will not listen." She waited. "Miss Ashcombe, I am here to do you a kindness. I do not bear you ill will. What I said at the Ledborough ball was 3 years ago, and I have come to see in time that it was perhaps abrupt. I do not retract the substance. You will understand. A man in my position must marry for blood and beauty. I have done so. My Duchess is a lovely girl. But what is correct for me may not be correct for my cousin. He is a small landowner. He may marry where he chooses. I have come, however, to advise you to refuse him." The cold from the stone wall was running up her arm now. She did not move her hand. "To advise me," she said. "My cousin is a sentimental man. He has fastened on the memory of your composure that night. He believes himself in love with an idea. He will tire of it. When he does, you will be left where you are, with no name, no fortune, and a great deal of foolish gossip. Spare him. Spare yourself. Refuse him now." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved a few brown leaves across Mrs. Halliver's grave. She looked at the asters, the small purple flowers that the youngest girl had carefully arranged that morning, and she thought of the old woman who had taken her in when she had nothing, and she thought of Gideon Renmark riding 3 days through mud and fleas, and she thought of the 6 rebuilt cottages in Brimble that he had never spoken of. "Your Grace," she said. "Yes. You once told me in a room full of people that I was too plain to be your wife. I curtsied. I left. I did not answer you then. I shall answer you now." He went still. He had not expected this either. "I was not too plain to be your wife," she said. "I was too poor and too quiet, and too useful at a small thing instead of a grand one. You called it plainness because plainness was the kindest of the true reasons. I have thought about this for 3 years. I am not angry with you anymore. I do not hate you. I do not even greatly dislike you. But I shall not take your advice on the subject of Mr. Renmark, because you have never in your life paid a small kindness that no one was watching, and he has. You do not know him. You do not know me. I shall make my own choice. Good afternoon, Your Grace." She turned. She walked. She did not look back. The Duke called her name once, and then again. She kept walking. The lich gate closed behind her with a small, clean sound. She walked back up the lane. The mud was thick on the hem of her gown. She did not care. She walked into the schoolhouse. She closed the door. She leaned against it for a moment. Anwen looked up from her slate with very wide eyes. "Miss?" "Eyes on your work, Anwen." Maren washed the chalk from her cheek. She picked up the pointer. She continued the lesson on long division, as if no duke had ever stood in the lane outside her door. That night, after the girls had gone home, she sat at her writing desk and she wrote one letter. She wrote it carefully. She wrote, "Dear Mr. Renmark, the year I asked for is not yet finished. There remains 6 weeks. I do not require you to wait the full term. If you have not changed your mind, you may come to Thornbury at any time after the 1st of the month. I shall be glad of your company. Yours, with respect, Maren Ashcombe." She sealed the letter. She rode to the post office herself the next morning to send it. He came in 11 days. He came on the same black horse. The horse was muddy again. He was muddy again. He arrived at the gate of the schoolhouse in the late afternoon, when the light was thin and the sky was already turning the colour of a bruise. She was in the schoolyard, sweeping the leaves into a corner. She had her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She had a streak of dirt on her forehead. She heard the hoofbeats. She did not turn at once. She finished the line of leaves. Then she stood the broom against the wall and she turned. He had dismounted. He was standing at the gate with his hat in his hand. His face was very tired and very still. She walked to the gate. She did not hurry. "Mr. Renmark. Miss Ashcombe." He did not say anything else. She could see in the set of his mouth and the line between his brows that he did not know what he was allowed to say. He had come a very long way. He had a horse to stable and a room to find at the inn. He had ridden 3 days for the chance to stand at a gate and look at her face. She thought slowly, in slow motion, of every step that had brought her to this moment. The cold of the ballroom floor, the weight of her cloak in her hand, the fog around the lamp-post, the cracks in the plaster ceiling, the youngest girl's missing tooth, Mrs. Halliver's thin hand, the Duke in the churchyard, the asters on the grave. She felt the small old wound in her chest open, very gently, and this time it did not bleed. It simply opened, the way a door opens. "Come in," she said. He did. He walked through the gate. He stopped a careful distance from her. He waited. She reached out. She took his hat from his hand and set it on the low wall. She took his hand in both of hers. His hand was very cold from the long ride. Her hands were warm from the broom. She did not kiss him. He did not kiss her. They stood in the schoolyard with their hands held between them, and the late light fell across the worn stones, and somewhere in the church the bell began to ring for evening prayer, slow and deep, the sound moving out across the moor. "Welcome to Thornbury, Mr. Renmark," she said. Her voice was steady, but it had gone soft. "I hope you do not mind cold rooms and small fires." "I do not mind anything," he said. "That is well," she said, "because there is also a cat. The cat snores." He almost laughed. She saw him almost laugh. The corner of his long mouth moved. The small scar at his temple moved with it. He did not let the laugh out. He only closed his other hand over hers, gently, as a man closes a book he means to read again tomorrow. They were married in the spring, in the small stone church, with the vicar presiding, and the 12 girls in the front pews in their best pinafores, holding bunches of wild yellow flowers from the ditches. The youngest girl, who was now 7 and had her front tooth back, was the flower girl. Maren wore a plain gown of pale grey silk. Her godmother came up from London on the coach and cried through the whole ceremony, and laughed afterward, and told everyone within hearing that she had always known. Anwen, who was now 15, signed the register as a witness. Her hand shook a little. She was very proud. Gideon's mother did not come. She wrote a long, cold letter explaining the impossibility. Maren read it once, folded it, and put it in the wooden box under the bed with the other letters. She did not answer it. Some battles, she had learned, were not worth the powder. They lived at Renmark Hall in the months that were not term time, and at the schoolhouse in Thornbury when the school was in session. Maren did not give up the school. She would not. Mrs. Halliver had given it to her. The girls were hers. Gideon understood this from the first. He never once asked her to choose. In the school months, he came up to Yorkshire when he could, and stayed at the inn so as not to scandalize anyone, and walked her home along the lane in the evenings, and sat by the smoky fire while she marked slates and told her about the marsh he was draining. 1 year later, in the autumn, there was a small domestic scene at Renmark Hall. It was a Thursday. The afternoon had been wet. The fires were lit early. The drawing room at Renmark Hall was not grand. The ceiling was low, the rugs were old, the windows looked out over a stretch of brown garden where the last of the apples had not yet been picked. Maren sat in a low chair by the fire. She had a book open in her lap. She was not reading it. She was watching the fire move. The cat, who had been brought from Thornbury in a basket and had not forgiven anyone yet, was asleep on the rug at her feet. The room smelled of wood smoke and the lavender that was kept in a small bowl on the table by the window. Gideon came in. He was carrying 2 cups of tea. He set one on the small table beside her. He sat down in the other low chair, across the fire from her. He did not speak for a while. "You are quiet tonight," she said. "I am content," he said. "I find I do not have much to say when I am content." She closed the book in her lap. She looked at him across the fire. His face had softened in the year of their marriage. The line between his brows was not so deep. His mouth was easier. He did not smile often, even now, but when he looked at her, his eyes did something that was almost the same as a smile, and she had learned to read it. "I had a letter from my godmother this morning," she said. "Oh, my cousin Pellingham's wife has given him a daughter, the 4th in 5 years. He is said to be displeased. Gideon raised one eyebrow. He picked up his cup. The cup was small in his hand. He always was a man who knew exactly what he wanted and was always being given something else. She thought about that. She turned it over in her mind. She thought about the candlelit ballroom 3 years and many months ago, and the smell of beeswax, and the deep curtsy in the river stone gown. She thought about the words he had said. Too plain to be his wife. She did not feel anything sharp about it now. It had been packed away, in the wooden box under the bed, with all the other letters that had once meant something, and now meant only that she had survived them. "Gideon," she said. "Yes. Do you remember the lamp at the corner of Carver Street?" He was quiet for a long moment. The fire snapped. A small piece of bark fell into the ashes. "I remember it," he said. "I have thought sometimes that the woman who pressed her hand against that iron railing could not have imagined this room." He set his cup down. He reached across the small space between their chairs. He did not take her hand. He laid his hand, palm up, on the arm of her chair. An offering, not a demand. She put her hand in his. She did not need to imagine it, he said. She only needed to keep walking. And she did. The fire moved. The cat stirred and resettled. Outside, somewhere in the garden, a thrush sang one short evening song, and then was quiet. Maren did not say anything else. She did not need to. She held his hand, and he held hers, and the small clock on the mantel ticked, and the tea cooled in its cups, and the long quiet of the evening settled around them like a shawl that had been warmed by the fire. She had walked out of that ballroom without a word. She had walked into this room without one too, but it was a different kind of silence now. The first had been the silence of a door closing. This was the silence of a door that had been opened, very slowly, by careful hands, and left open, because there was no longer any reason to close it. Far away in London, in a great house with many candles, a man who had once been certain of every word he spoke was now sitting alone in his study, holding a glass of dark wine he did not really want, looking at a portrait of a young wife who did not love him and could not be made to. Maren did not know this, and would not have wished it on him if she had. She was past wishing him anything at all. In a small low room in Northumberland, with the fire warm and the cat snoring and her husband's hand in hers, she had become a woman the ballroom would not have recognized. Not because she had grown beautiful, she had not. Her nose was still long, her mouth was still wide, her hair was still simply brown. The years had put 2 small lines at the corners of her eyes. What had changed was simpler than beauty. She had been seen. She had been chosen not as a prize but as a person, and she had let herself, after a long, careful time, be loved by a man who had ridden 3 days through mud to ask if he might write her letters. Gideon's thumb moved, once, against the back of her hand. Such a small thing, the kind of thing a person does without thinking. She felt it through her glove, which was thinner than the one she had worn that long-ago night. She felt it through her skin. "Maren," he said. "Yes. Stay." It was not a question. He was not asking her to stay tonight, or this week, or any small thing. He was naming the choice she had already made and would keep making. It was the way he said things, in single words, when single words were enough. "I shall," she said. The fire moved again. The cat sighed in its sleep. The thrush in the garden began its evening song a second time, longer now, more sure. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the half-hour. Neither of them moved. They sat with their hands joined across the small space between their chairs, and they let the silence be exactly what it was, which was a kind of music that did not need any other instrument. She had curtsied. She had left without a word. She had walked through the fog with a stranger who had not made her speak. She had taught 12 girls to read. She had buried an old woman. She had refused a duke's advice in a country churchyard with the wind in her shawl. She had written 31 letters and kept 31 in a wooden box. She had said, "Come in." And here at last was where the long road of all those small choices had led. Not to a palace, not to a throne, to a low room with a smoky fire and a snoring cat, and a man whose hand was warm in hers, and whose silence, when he chose silence, said more than other men's speeches. She closed her eyes. She listened to the fire. She listened to her own breath. She listened to his. When she opened her eyes again, he was watching her across the small distance. He was not smiling. He almost never smiled, but his eyes were doing the thing that was almost the same as a smile. And she knew, with the calm certainty of a woman who had once stood very still in a candle-lit ballroom while a man told her she was not enough, that she would never again, for the rest of her life, have to ask whether she was enough for the man who looked at her now. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. That was all. That was everything. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive.